It was a night filled with joy, laughter, and the kind of pride only parents feel when watching their child achieve something significant. If this story has you hooked, hit subscribe and turn on notifications to catch more gripping tales like this one. And share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Sarah had planned every detail of her daughter Emma's graduation dinner to perfection. The reservations were made weeks in advance at one of the finest restaurants in town. The air buzzed with the hum of soft chatter and clinking glasses as family and friends gathered to celebrate Emma's big milestone. But amidst the festive atmosphere, Sarah felt a faint unease she couldn't quite place. Sarah, a woman in her late 50s, had always been perceptive, especially when it came to her family. Her husband, David, sat across the table, laughing heartily at a joke Emma's college roommate, Grace, had shared. Grace had been living with Emma for 2 years, practically a part of the family now. Sarah liked Grace well enough, but something about her presence tonight seemed off. David, usually reserved, appeared unusually animated around Grace. He complimented her dress twice, called her charming, and even poured her wine before anyone else's. Small gestures, yes, but they didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. Perhaps she was overthinking. After all, tonight was about Emma, and Sarah didn't want her suspicions, however baseless, to ruin the evening. But then came the moment that changed everything. As they were toasting Emma's success, David raised his glass with a peculiar smile and said, "Here's to unforgettable memories, and the people who make them truly special." His eyes lingered on Grace a second too long. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Was it just a warm gesture, or was there something deeper hidden in his tone? The thought stayed with her as the evening progressed. Grace, usually shy in large gatherings, seemed unusually comfortable tonight. She laughed at all of David's jokes, even the terrible ones. When Emma left the table to greet her friends across the room, Sarah caught a glimpse of something she hadn't expected. David leaned closer to Grace, whispering something that made her blush and glance nervously at Sarah. It was subtle, fleeting, but enough to plant the first seed of doubt. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Why was David acting this way? And why was Grace, barely out of college, reacting so intimately? Was there a reasonable explanation, or was she staring at the beginning of something that would shatter her world? Sarah didn't know the answers yet, but her heart whispered one truth. Something was terribly wrong. She didn't want to believe it. What wife would? But sometimes the smallest cracks in a façade are where the truth begins to seep through. What would you have done in her place? Shrug it off as nothing, or start piecing together the signs, no matter how painful the picture might become? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. The rest of the dinner felt like a blur, the conversations around her merging into a low hum as her thoughts took over. She found herself watching David and Grace more closely, though careful not to draw attention to her unease. Every shared glance, every exchange of words between them seemed layered with something unspoken. Or was her imagination running wild? She wasn't sure anymore. Then an opportunity came. David excused himself to take a call outside, leaving Grace momentarily alone at the table. Sarah took a deep breath and leaned toward Grace, her voice calm but her heart racing. "You and David seem to get along quite well," she said, keeping her tone casual. Grace looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Oh, he's been so kind to me," Grace replied, her words carefully measured. "He's like a second father, really." A second father. The words should have comforted Sarah, but instead they unsettled her further. There was a stiffness in Grace's voice, a slight tremor that didn't match her usual cheerful demeanor. Sarah didn't press further, though her mind screamed for answers. She knew better than to confront anyone without evidence. She would wait, watch, and gather the pieces before making any accusations. When David returned, Sarah noticed he was holding his phone a little too tightly. His face carried a faint tension, as if the call hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. He avoided her gaze as he sat back down, resuming the light-hearted conversation with Grace. It was a small detail, but it lingered in Sarah's mind. What kind of call would leave him so rattled? The night wore on, and as the guests began to disperse, Sarah offered to settle the bill while David helped Emma and Grace gather their belongings. She needed a moment alone, a chance to clear her thoughts. As she walked toward the restaurant counter, she passed by the hallway leading to the restrooms and froze. There they were, David and Grace standing close together, their voices low and hurried. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but their body language spoke volumes. David's hand briefly touched Grace's arm, in a gesture that was far too intimate for Sarah's comfort. Grace looked up at him, her expression a mix of nervousness and something else Sarah couldn't quite define. She stood there, hidden by the shadows of the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she confront them now, or would that make her seem paranoid? She decided against it, knowing that confronting them in such a public setting could escalate things. But deep down, she knew she had just witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. As they left the restaurant, Sarah's mind swirled with questions. Was she reading too much into the situation, or had she just uncovered the first threads of a web of betrayal? She couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The answers she sought wouldn't come from assumptions. They would come from finding the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And as they drove home, the silence in the car felt heavier than ever. That night, the house was unusually quiet. Emma had gone to bed early, worn out from the celebrations, and Grace had retreated to the guest room. David sat in the living room, scrolling through his phone, while Sarah lingered in the kitchen, pretending to tidy up. In reality, she was watching him. His body language, his expressions, the way he kept glancing at the hallway leading to the guest rooms. Something about him felt off. Sarah debated her next move. Should she confront him now, or would it be wiser to wait? Her instincts told her to tread carefully. The last thing she wanted was to tip him off if there was indeed something to hide. Instead, she decided to test the waters. She walked into the living room and casually asked, "David, what did you think of Grace tonight?" "She seemed more talkative than usual, don't you think?" David looked up, startled by the question. "Grace?" "Oh yeah, she was fine. She's a good kid," he said quickly, his tone flat and dismissive. Too dismissive. Sarah noticed how he avoided her eyes, pretending to focus on his phone. "A good kid?" Sarah pressed, keeping her tone light. "She's more like a young woman now, don't you think?" David chuckled nervously. "Sure, I guess. But why are we talking about Grace? Shouldn't we be talking about Emma and how proud we are of her?" He tried to steer the conversation away, but Sarah wasn't ready to let it drop. "Well, it's just that I noticed you two talking quite a bit tonight," she said, watching his reaction carefully. His face stiffened ever so slightly, a flicker of tension that he quickly masked with a shrug. "She's Emma's friend," he said, his tone sharper now. "I was just being polite." Polite. Sarah let the word hang in the air for a moment, as if weighing its meaning. She decided not to push further, at least not yet. Instead, she smiled and said, "Of course. I must be overthinking things. Good night, David." And with that, she turned and headed upstairs, leaving him alone in the living room. But sleep didn't come easily for Sarah. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replayed the events of the evening, the glances, the whispers, the tension in David's voice. Something wasn't right, and she knew she couldn't rest until she got to the bottom of it. Quietly, she got out of bed and made her way downstairs. She found David's phone sitting on the coffee table, unlocked. Her heart raced as she picked it up, debating for a moment whether she should invade his privacy, but her suspicions were too strong to ignore. What she found made her stomach drop. There were messages between David and Grace, hidden under a contact name that Sarah didn't recognize. The tone of the messages was anything but polite. Flirty, secretive, and unmistakably inappropriate, they confirmed what Sarah had feared. One message in particular stood out. "Can't wait for our next talk. Tonight was too risky." Her hands shook as she put the phone back exactly where she found it. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she returned to bed, her mind racing with plans. Whatever was going on between David and Grace, Sarah was determined to uncover the whole truth, and this time she wouldn't let him dismiss her with vague excuses. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Morning arrived, but the sunlight filtering through the windows did little to ease the heaviness in Sarah's chest. She moved through her usual routine, making coffee, preparing breakfast, but her mind was elsewhere. The messages she had seen on David's phone replayed in her head like a haunting melody, each word deepening her sense of betrayal. David came into the kitchen, smiling as if nothing had happened. He kissed Sarah on the cheek and said, "Good morning, love. You didn't sleep well, did you?" I could tell. His voice carried a casual concern that would have seemed sweet on any other day. But to Sarah, it felt like mockery, as though he was trying to play the part of the perfect husband while hiding his dirty secrets. "I didn't," she replied evenly, pouring herself another cup of coffee. "I guess I just have a lot on my mind." She glanced at him, gauging his reaction. He looked at her briefly before focusing on his toast. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, his tone so casual it bordered on dismissive. Sarah considered confronting him right then and there, but decided against it. She needed more time, more proof. A part of her still hoped there was some other explanation, though deep down she doubted it. "Not yet," she replied with a small smile, masking the storm brewing inside her. "Maybe later." Grace entered the kitchen next, her hair still damp from the shower, and greeted them cheerfully. "Morning. Thanks again for last night. It was such a lovely dinner," she said, flashing them both a bright smile. Sarah noticed the way Grace avoided looking at her directly, focusing instead on David, who returned the smile a little too warmly. "Oh, it was our pleasure," Sarah said, her voice steady but her gaze sharp. "We're so happy you could join us. You're practically family now." The words felt bitter in her mouth, but she delivered them with a kind smile that masked her true feelings. As breakfast continued, Sarah observed them closely, noting every small detail. The way David laughed at Grace's jokes, the way Grace leaned slightly toward him when speaking, the way they avoided talking when Sarah was too close. All of it painted a picture she wished she couldn't see. And then there was Emma, oblivious to the tension around her, happily discussing her plans for the weekend with her roommate. When the meal was over, Sarah made her move. "Grace, could you help me with the dishes?" she asked, keeping her tone light. Grace hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, following Sarah into the kitchen. They worked in silence for a while, the clinking of plates and running water the only sounds between them. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "You and Emma have become such good friends. It must feel like you've known each other forever." Grace smiled nervously. "Yeah, she's amazing. I'm really lucky to have her." "And David?" Sarah asked, her tone casual, but her eyes fixed on Grace. "You two seem close too." The plate Grace was holding slipped slightly in her hands and she fumbled to catch it. "Oh, yeah, he's great. Very kind." Her voice wavered, and Sarah caught the faintest hint of panic in her eyes. "Kind? Yes," Sarah repeated, drying her hands on a towel. "But sometimes kindness can be complicated, don't you think?" She let the question hang in the air, watching as Grace's face flushed with color. Before Grace could respond, David appeared in the doorway. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his voice a little too firm. His sudden presence only confirmed Sarah's suspicions. He was watching her just as closely as she was watching him. "Oh, everything's fine," Sarah said with a sweet smile. "Just girl talk." But as David and Grace exchanged a brief, nervous glance, Sarah knew that whatever they were hiding, it was only a matter of time before it unraveled, and she was determined to be the one to pull the thread. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind after the tense encounter in the kitchen. Grace's nervousness and David's abrupt appearance had only solidified her suspicions. She knew it was time to take the first step toward uncovering the truth, even if it meant confronting things she wasn't ready to face. But Sarah had always been patient. She understood that catching someone in a lie required strategy, not impulsiveness. Later that day, when David left to run errands and Emma went out with friends, Sarah saw her chance. Grace was in her room, presumably studying or scrolling through her phone. Sarah took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Grace called, her voice cheerful but slightly tense. Sarah stepped inside, offering a warm smile. "Hey, I thought we could chat for a bit. I don't get enough time with you girls now that you're all grown up." Grace smiled politely, setting her phone aside. "Of course, Mrs. Harding. What's on your mind?" Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, feigning a casual air. "I just wanted to thank you again for being such a good friend to Emma. You've really become a part of the family." "Oh, thank you," Grace said, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Emma's been amazing to me too." Sarah tilted her head, watching Grace carefully. "And David? He seems to think the world of you. He mentioned how much he enjoys talking to you. That must feel nice." Grace's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Yeah, he's been really supportive, like a mentor, you know." "Supportive," Sarah echoed, her voice steady. "That's an interesting word. I suppose that's why you two were talking so much at dinner last night." She let the question hang, her tone light but her gaze unwavering. Grace's hands fidgeted in her lap. "Oh, I mean, we were just talking about school stuff. You know, he's always curious about my classes and future plans." Sarah nodded, leaning in slightly. "Of course. It's wonderful that he takes such an interest. But Grace, you know you can tell me anything, right? If there's ever something on your mind, I'd want to know." Grace froze, her face a mix of panic and confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Harding." Sarah smiled softly, but didn't let up. "Sometimes it's hard to know where boundaries should be, especially with family friends. I just want to make sure everything's as it should be, that no one feels uncomfortable." Grace's reaction spoke volumes. Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding Sarah's gaze, and she stammered a quick, "Everything's fine, really." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Grace's arm, her voice calm but firm. "I'm glad to hear that. But if there's ever anything I should know, Grace, please don't hesitate to tell me. Secrets have a way of hurting everyone involved." Grace nodded quickly, mumbling a thank you, but Sarah could see the cracks forming in her composure. She left the room with a sense of grim satisfaction. Grace might not have confessed outright, but her reaction was enough to confirm that there was more to the story. Back in her own room, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts racing. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a puzzle, and she was slowly gathering the pieces. But she needed something concrete, something undeniable. She knew the time had come to look deeper, to dig into the parts of David's life he thought were hidden from her. If he wasn't going to tell her the truth, she'd find it herself. And so, with her heart pounding and her resolve firm, Sarah picked up her laptop and began her search. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened her laptop and typed in the password. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creaks of the floorboards as Grace moved about upstairs. Sarah had always trusted David. At least she had thought she did. Now, every shred of doubt she felt was being funneled into this moment. If there were secrets to uncover, she'd find them here. She started by accessing their shared email account. It had been years since they'd used it regularly, but David still received some automated updates there. As she scrolled through old messages, nothing seemed out of place. Receipts, newsletters, the occasional family correspondence. But then, a strange notification caught her eye. It was from an encrypted messaging app she didn't recognize. David wasn't exactly tech-savvy. Why would he need such an app? Sarah clicked the notification, but it led nowhere. It was just an alert confirming a sent message. Frustrated but not deterred, she turned her focus to his phone records. They had a joint mobile plan, which meant she could easily access his call logs and text history online, and there it was. Over the past month, David had exchanged dozens of messages with a number Sarah didn't recognize. The messages weren't saved on his phone, but the call records told a different story. Long, late-night conversations, frequent, brief calls during the day. The number was marked private in the account settings, but Sarah knew one thing. It wasn't a coincidence. She wrote the number down on a piece of paper and stared at it. Should she call it? The thought made her heart pound. She wasn't ready to hear a stranger's voice on the other end, or worse, Grace's. Instead, she decided to trace the number. Using a reverse phone lookup tool online, Sarah hoped to find out who the number belonged to. The results left her breathless. The number was registered to a prepaid phone, the kind people use when they don't want to be traced. That alone sent a chill down her spine. Why would David need to communicate with someone this way? And why go to such lengths to hide it? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The messaging app, the prepaid number, the way David and Grace had acted at dinner, it all fit together too well to be a coincidence. But she needed more. Suspicion wasn't enough. She needed undeniable proof. Determined, Sarah decided to check the family's shared cloud storage. David often backed up his phone data there, including photos and videos. It was a long shot, but she couldn't leave any stone unturned. As she browsed through the folders, her stomach tightened. There was a hidden folder, one she'd never seen before, buried deep within the cloud. Its name was simple: Misk. Sarah clicked on it, and her heart nearly stopped. Inside were photos of Grace. Some were innocent enough, taken during family gatherings and holidays. But others were far from innocent. One photo showed Grace smiling at the camera, wearing the same dress she'd worn to dinner the night before. The timestamp revealed it was taken just hours before the event. Another showed her laughing, the camera angle suggesting it had been taken in secret. But the most damning photo was a close-up of Grace holding a coffee mug, her hand resting on a table. On the table was a man's hand, David's hand, unmistakable with his wedding band clearly visible. Sarah stared at the screen, her body frozen in disbelief. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no denying the truth anymore. David wasn't just being kind to Grace. He was betraying their family in the worst possible way. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. There was no time for breakdowns. She wasn't the kind of woman who crumbled under pressure. If David thought he could lie to her and get away with it, he was wrong. She'd make sure of that. And as the weight of her discovery settled over her, a darker thought began to take root. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about what she would do next. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, those photos flashed in her mind like a terrible slideshow, each one eroding her trust further. By dawn, she had made up her mind. David would have to answer for this. There was no hiding from the truth anymore. As the morning light crept into the house, Sarah heard David moving around in the kitchen. She got up, her resolve solid, but her emotions raw. She walked downstairs, her steps steady, rehearsing her words in her head. Confronting him in front of Emma or Grace would only complicate things, so she waited until Grace left for a morning jog and Emma was still asleep. David looked up from his coffee as Sarah entered the room. "Good morning," he said, offering her the same easy smile he'd worn for years. But now to Sarah, it felt like a mask she was about to rip off. "Morning," she replied curtly, sitting down across from him. She placed her phone on the table and met his gaze directly. "David, we need to talk." David froze for a moment, his smile faltering. "About what?" "About Grace," Sarah said bluntly, her voice steady. She watched his face carefully, looking for the slightest twitch, the smallest flicker of guilt. He blinked, then frowned. "Grace. What about her?" Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "Don't play dumb, David. I know what's going on. The messages, the photos, the way you've been acting around her. Do you really think I wouldn't notice?" David's face drained of color. For a moment he said nothing, as if weighing his options. Then he shook his head and scoffed. "This is ridiculous, Sarah. You're imagining things." Sarah didn't flinch. She unlocked her phone and slid it across the table, the incriminating photos displayed on the screen. "Am I?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Explain these then." David stared at the screen, his expression shifting from denial to panic. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, his tone defensive. "Does it matter?" Sarah shot back. "What matters is that you've been lying to me, to Emma, to all of us. So, tell me the truth, David. How long has this been going on?" David opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again. The silence that followed was deafening, and Sarah felt her anger rising with every passing second. "I trusted you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I trusted you, and you betrayed me." Finally, David broke his silence. "Sarah, it's not what you think. Grace and I—" "Don't you dare try to downplay this," Sarah interrupted, her voice now laced with fury. "I saw the photos. I read the messages. How can you sit there and act like this is nothing?" David slumped in his chair, defeated. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was a mistake." Sarah's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "A mistake?" she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "You call months of lies and betrayal a mistake? You didn't just betray me. You betrayed Emma. How do you think she'll feel when she finds out what you've done?" David's head snapped up, fear flashing in his eyes. "She can't know," he said quickly. "It'll destroy her." Sarah stood, her hands trembling. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided to pursue her best friend, David. You should have thought about the consequences before you made those choices." Before he could respond, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the kitchen. Her mind was made up. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sarah retreated to her bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind her. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it had also steeled her resolve. She wasn't going to let David off the hook so easily. He might have admitted to his mistake, but she knew there was more to the story. And if he wouldn't tell her the full truth, she'd find it herself. She sat down at her desk, her thoughts racing. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there were still gaps. What was Grace's role in all of this? Was she a victim of David's manipulation, or had she willingly participated in this betrayal? And most importantly, how far had things really gone between them? Sarah decided to dig deeper, starting with Grace. She waited until Grace returned from her jog, then called her into the living room. "Grace, do you have a minute?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Grace hesitated, her expression wary. Sure, she said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. Sarah sat across from her, fixing her with a steady gaze. I need you to be honest with me, she began. What's going on between you and David? Grace's face paled, and she looked away. Nothing, she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Grace, Sarah said, her voice sharp but controlled. I've seen the photos. I've read the messages. I know everything. Grace's shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for this to happen. Sarah leaned forward, her anger tempered by a growing sense of pity. Then tell me the truth. How long has this been going on? Grace hesitated, then finally looked up at Sarah, tears streaming down her face. It started a few months ago, she admitted. He told me it was just harmless fun at first, that it didn't mean anything, but I didn't know how to stop it. Sarah's stomach churned as she listened, but she forced herself to remain calm. And now? Are you still involved? Grace shook her head. I told him it had to stop, but he keeps finding ways to talk to me. I didn't know what to do. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing. Grace's confession confirmed her worst fears, but it also gave her a new perspective. David had manipulated Grace just as he had lied to Sarah. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a violation of trust on every level. As Grace sat there, sobbing quietly, Sarah felt a mix of anger and determination. She had all the proof she needed now, but the question remained. What would she do with it? The answer was clear. She wasn't just going to confront David again. She was going to take control of the situation. And she knew exactly where to start. Sarah didn't wait. She spent the rest of the day putting her plan into action. First, she gathered every piece of evidence she had. The messages, the photos, the call logs. She compiled them into a folder on her computer, labeling it simply Truth. She wasn't sure how far she would need to go, but she wanted to be prepared for any outcome. When David returned home that evening, Sarah was waiting in the living room. She didn't give him a chance to settle in. She handed him a printed copy of the photos and messages, her face devoid of emotion. We're done pretending, David, she said firmly. Here's the proof of what you've done. You have two choices. Tell Emma everything yourself, or I will. David's face turned ashen as he flipped through the papers. Sarah, please, he began, his voice trembling. You can't do this. It'll ruin everything. It already has, she replied, her voice icy. You ruined everything the moment you decided to betray this family. Now it's about accountability. You don't get to escape this. David dropped the papers onto the table, his shoulders slumping. I'll tell her, he muttered. Just give me time. You have until tomorrow, Sarah said. No excuses. If you don't do it, I will. And don't think I won't involve Grace. She deserves to tell her side of this too. David nodded weakly, defeated. Sarah left him alone in the living room, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on her. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed, for better or worse. The next morning, Sarah called Emma and Grace into the living room. David sat silently on the couch, avoiding everyone's gaze. Sarah remained standing, her arms crossed as she addressed the group. There's something your father needs to tell you, she said, her voice calm but firm. David. David hesitated, his face pale. Finally, he looked at Emma, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma, I've made a terrible mistake. I've been unfaithful with Grace. Emma froze, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. What? That can't be true, she stammered, looking between her parents and her roommate. Grace, already tearful, spoke up. It's true, she said quietly. But it's not what you think. I didn't. I didn't want this." Emma stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "How could you?" she yelled, her voice cracking. "You've destroyed everything. I trusted you, both of you." David tried to reach for her, but Emma pulled away, her voice rising. Don't you dare try to explain. I don't want to hear it." Grace buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah stood silently, her heart breaking for her daughter, but knowing this moment was necessary. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The days that followed were a blur of anger, tears, and shattered trust. Emma packed her bags and left for a friend's house, unable to face either her father or Grace. David stayed in the guest room, his once confident demeanor now replaced with guilt and shame. Grace moved out the same week, her relationship with Emma irreparably damaged. Sarah began consulting a lawyer, determined to end her marriage. She had spent years building a life with David, but there was no salvaging what he had broken. As she sat in the lawyer's office reviewing the paperwork, she felt a sense of resolve. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she would rebuild, on her terms. Emma eventually returned, her relationship with Sarah stronger than ever. They spent hours talking, healing, and planning for the future. Sarah knew the scars of betrayal would remain, but she also knew they were stronger together. David, on the other hand, faded into the background of their lives. He moved into a small apartment across town, alone and estranged from his family. The choices he made had left him with nothing but regret, a fitting consequence for the pain he caused. Months later, as Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset, she felt a strange sense of peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. She had faced the truth, no matter how brutal, and taken control of her life again. Her thoughts often returned to that fateful night at the graduation dinner, the night when everything began to unravel. She couldn't change what had happened, but she had learned from it. She had rediscovered her strength, her dignity, and her ability to move forward. And as she sipped her tea, she reflected on the most important lesson of all: secrets, no matter how well hidden, always find their way to the surface. The question isn't whether the truth will come out, it's whether you're strong enough to face it when it does.